I think it would be so sweet if we could do a worldwide ban of glyphosate and shut down the factories where it's being produced. I'd love to see if we did that, how would our health change? To what extent is glyphosate the problem versus all the other stuff? Would we see no difference, or would there be a substantial improvement? I don't know. But I think glyphosate's a major player in many of these diseases that we're seeing, the diabetes, the heart disease, the lung disease. I mean, all of these things are going up dramatically in the population in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. And they're also, when you have these diseases, you have a higher risk of a bad outcome of ending up in the ICU with COVID-19. That's been shown in
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Glyphosate residues are in our food, air, and water. How can we combat this carcinogenic toxin that could be contributing to our current global health crisis? This is episode 317, and our guest today is Dr. Stephanie Seneff, an MIT scientist. She has been studying the effects of glyphosate for decades. Today, she highlights what she's found. She discusses glyphosate's role in respiratory illness, including COVID, how it is found in biofuels, which are touted as environmentally beneficial, and what a glyphosate map revealed about spikes in COVID cases and the possible relationship between the two. She also talks about what we can do to lessen glyphosate's effects on us, from Epsom salt baths to eating nutrient-dense food to the benefits of getting sunlight and grounding. She also offers an idea for an overall solution for preventing glyphosate contamination. Before we get into it, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Redmond Real Salt. Most salts on the market have been heat processed and stripped of their natural trace minerals. Real Salt, brand sea salt on the other hand, is unrefined and full of natural minerals and flavor, the way salt was meant to be savored. You guys, I love this salt so much, I literally take it with me everywhere I go. It makes me so happy to add it liberally on just about any dish. And I've collaborated with my favorite salt company, to bring you a special discount. Head to redmond.life and use the code word WISE for 15% off at checkout. Again, that's Redmond, REDMOND.life, LIFE, and use the code word WISE for 15% off. And being salty is a good thing. Keep that in mind. Check out Wise Traditions Podcast 270 with Sally Fallon Morell, or Wise Traditions Podcast 311 with Daryl Bosshart, the head of Redmond Real Salt, for more information. And while you're on our website, order our free info pack for more insights on healthy traditional diets. Literally, just click on the Order Free Info Pack button on our site, westonaprice.org, and get our most popular brochure on the subject, along with some background on the Weston A. Price Foundation. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Stephanie.
Oh, so delighted to be here. Thank you.
Right now, we're going through a very difficult time with this COVID-19 pandemic marching across the world, as you've said before. And I know you're an expert in glyphosate, and I understand that you have a theory that it might be playing a role in the spread of this virus. Can you explain?
Yes, I think that's a possibility. And I've become aware that glyphosate disrupts the innate immune system, in part because it disrupts the gut microbiome. And that's so crucial for the development of the immune system. And when your innate immune system is weak, your adaptive immune system kicks in and can cause damage because it overreacts to the virus. And that's what I'm seeing in the cases that are ending up in the ICU. I think it's possible that people who have been exposed to more glyphosate through their lifespan are more susceptible to ending up in the ICU if they catch this COVID-19 virus.
And I know glyphosate is in our food stream. Where else can we find it?
Yeah, glyphosate is all over the food supply. And the thing that I found really interesting is I started to look into COVID-19. I started to notice, first of all, Wuhan is a city that's known for air pollution. So I sort of figured something in the air could be causing lung damage. And of course, there are many toxic chemicals in the air that do, in fact, damage the lungs. So that is part of the problem. And then there's a question of whether glyphosate could be in the air and whether that could be something new that wasn't true maybe 5-10 years ago. And I knew about ethanol. We in the United States has played a leadership role in putting ethanol into gasoline. We now have like 10% ethanol in most of our gasoline supply in this country, which is much higher than what most other countries do. And we also have a much higher problem with COVID-19, and those two could be connected. Although it looked to me like the epidemiology was pointing to something else, because Europe was also really hit hard by COVID-19. And they had a lot less ethanol in their gasoline. So I sort of thought, well, maybe that's not really the case. Maybe that's not the problem. I became aware at that point that there's actually another kind of biofuel called biodiesel. And I wasn't aware of biodiesel until I started to look into COVID-19. And then I discovered, of course, Europe has always embraced diesel much more than the US has. I think they have some 20% of their vehicles are diesel driven. Their cars are diesel driven. We have a lot of diesel trucks, and buses are often diesel fuel. But our cars are mostly run on gasoline, maybe 2% diesel. So that would really favor Europe over the US. But the introduction of biodiesel was something I was not aware of. And I started reading about it and I was like, oh my God, because there's many different ways to end up with biodiesel. All of them involve some kind of crops, either the forest industry or the food industry. In Europe, they convert olive oil into biodiesel, and olive trees are routinely treated with glyphosate around the trees to kill the weeds. So there could be glyphosate in the olive oil. And the Europeans import a lot of their biodiesel from Argentina, which is a major supplier of biodiesel around the world. Argentina exports maybe half of their biodiesel. Their biodiesel is derived from GMO Roundup Ready soybean crops. So that's likely to have glyphosate in it. The United States has played a leadership role in developing a kind of biodiesel that's based on the residue after you've harvested the crop. And that's attractive because now you're not turning your food into fuel. You still are able to harvest the food from the crop. And then you take what's left over after you've harvested the corn or the wheat. There's still residue. There's various stalks and whatnot that you can scoop up and throw onto a barge and ship them down to a site where they can turn it into biodiesel fuel. Now, that's really much more problematic because we spray wheat with glyphosate right before harvest, and corn is a GMO Roundup Ready crop.
So in other words, we thought by coming up with biodiesel fuel, we were helping the environment, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. I mean, again, it's all speculation at this point. It needs to have some science behind it, but it's an interesting thought. New York City, it has played a leadership role in the idea of putting biodiesel into the diesel fuel. And they have some 11,000 vehicles on the road in New York City that run on biodiesel, at least in part. New York City, of course, is by far the biggest hotspot in this country. Huge amount of problems with people ending up in the ICU and dying from COVID-19. It's a metropolitan area, of course, so the air is polluted in any case. Diesel itself is toxic. Biodiesel has actually been investigated by many papers where they've shown that it causes an inflammatory reaction that's worse than whatever is caused by diesel itself. So they know there's something in the biodiesel that's causing inflammation. Inflammation is what's causing trouble in the lungs when you respond to COVID-19. The adaptive immune system goes into overdrive and produces these cytokines. This is what's called, you can call it a cytokine storm, when it becomes so out of control that you end up with sepsis and multiple organ failure because of this acute reaction of the adaptive immune system. And that's because the innate immune system is too weak. It's been hurt by glyphosate and other chemicals, of course, that are in our environment.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I get this straight. So the adaptive immune system is kind of like a backup plan or a second line of defense against whatever is attacking our bodies. And it kind of kicks into drive when the innate system is overwhelmed. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And the innate system gets overwhelmed because it's weak, and it's weak because of glyphosate and other chemicals that we're exposed to. And I suspect if it is true that glyphosate's in the biodiesel, it's actually getting incorporated. It's working together with the organic material from the diesel itself that's toxic. There's these organic compounds that are known to be toxic in diesel fuel. Those are mixing together with the glyphosate. And they're probably, as I'm suspecting, they're increasing the likelihood that glyphosate would be taken up by the cells in the lung because of the surfactant effect of these oils, of these other ingredients in the biodiesel fuel. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's like, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that this isn't necessarily the cause of the virus, but it is making us much more vulnerable to it.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. It's making people much sicker when they catch the virus. Other people, don't even know they have it, right? They're finding people testing positive who have no symptoms whatsoever. So what's the difference between someone who ends up in the ICU and someone who has no symptoms? The difference is the strength of their innate immune system. Normally, you'd be able to just clear the virus and not even think twice about it. Maybe get a little cold, But because of this damage to your innate immune system, your body is not able to fight the virus properly, and you end up overdoing the adaptive aspect, releasing all these cytokines, and also having an insufficient antioxidant defenses. And a lot of the things they're recommending, the alternative medicine community is recommending a lot of things to take that are all antioxidants, things like melatonin. Of course, getting sunlight, vitamin D, is really important for your immune system. And taking glutathione or taking precursors to glutathione like N-acetylcysteine, things that would boost your glutathione, and taking high-dose vitamin C. Those are all really excellent antioxidants. And the problem is that your immune system is releasing all these oxidizing agents trying to kill the virus because it can't actually just scoop up the virus and remove it, which is what the innate system should be able to do, but it's not able to do that. So the virus multiplies and gets out of control.
Wow. Well, this is a lot of information to take in. And I'm glad that you mentioned those supplements. Would you actually recommend that we take more of those to try to help our innate immune system?
I generally don't like supplements. I prefer, as you know, natural things. So eating foods that are high in sulfur. I do like Epsom salt baths. That's my one big exception with respect to supplements. Epsom salt baths will give you the sulfur. Sulfur is super important for the immune system. Getting out in the sunlight, walking along the shore barefoot to get the grounding, and to get the sunlight and the hydrogen sulfide gas from the ocean. And all of those are going to be helpful. Of course, eating organic food, that's super, super important.
Okay, so those of us who may be in urban, metropolitan areas may be more susceptible because of the biodiesel fuel that contains glyphosate. We may be breathing in polluted air that, again, is compromising our innate immune system and even making the adaptive immune system struggle to combat this virus. What about those people who are living somewhere far from the maddening crowd? Like, how does your glyphosate map, so to speak, overlap with the map of infectious cases?
I think most of the big infections are in the cities, and especially in places that have airports. Like, for example, out west, there's sort of Denver and Salt Lake City are both sort of hot spots that stand out in the Midwest. And those have major airports. I think it may very well be connected to the airplanes that are flying with the biodiesel fuel. That's a thought that I have. Metropolitan areas obviously have polluted air, and there's lots of pollution in the air. All these nanoparticles, probably aluminum works very badly with glyphosate. So all of those things are kind of mixing in. It's hard to say to what extent it's glyphosate versus all the other stuff that's in the air pollution. But I definitely think anybody who's living in a place where the air is bad needs to be worried. And if you can live far away from that, you'll be good, as long as you're not hanging out next to a bunch of fields where they're growing glyphosate contaminated crops. Because if they're spraying glyphosate in the air in the farm next door, you're not going to be in good shape, I don't think.
Well, speaking of not being in good shape, I think of the trend of vaping right now. Can you speak to that and its possible role in this as well?
Yes, it's extremely interesting. And that's what actually led me to write the article that I wrote for Jennifer Margulis on her blog site. I was aware that vaping was causing an odd lung disease, some bizarre lung disease that they had not seen before. And this was true before COVID-19 even appeared on the scene. I was aware of it even before COVID-19. I was curious about it and I was looking into it because vaping is based on a new way of getting a cigarette, to get nicotine through a mechanism that's not the same as a normal smoking of a cigarette. And it involves these liquid mix that has a glycerol as a main component. And the glycerol is derived from the residue when you process the raw materials of the biomass to turn it into biodiesel in those factories where that's done. The residue can be used to make glycerol. So I'm suspecting that the glycerol in these cigarettes is contaminated with glyphosate and causing damage to the lungs. And it turns out that the symptoms of that condition look exactly like an infection with COVID-19 infection. COVID-19 disease is characterized by sort of a dry cough, and difficulty breathing is a very strong feature of it. A slight fever and no runny nose. So colds usually have a runny nose, but there's no runny nose with this COVID-19 disease. That is exactly the same symptoms that you see with this lung disease that's happening with the e-cigarette smokers. And so I think that's very curious. And that's actually what led me to feel more confident in saying that it could be a consequence of this introduction of biodiesel fuel, because that is a new thing that's happened, really been escalating in just the last few years. So that separates it from other forms of glyphosate exposure, which have been going on for much longer.
Yes, you're right. I've heard news reports of young people who would have these horrible symptoms, the ones you were describing that have been associated with COVID-19, the dry cough, the fever, the difficulty breathing. And it was alarming, but somehow these things are still on the market. Explain that to me, Stephanie.
I wish I could explain that to you. I do not understand why any of these things are on the market. I really hope that we will eventually wake up as a species and realize we can't keep doing this. We really need to shut down a lot of the factories where these toxic chemicals are being produced and get rid of them. I think it would be so sweet if we could do a worldwide ban of glyphosate and shut down the factories where it's being produced. I'd love to see if we did that, how would our health change? To what extent is glyphosate the problem versus all the other stuff? Would we see no difference, or would there be a substantial improvement? I don't know. But I think glyphosate's a major player in many of these diseases that we're seeing, the diabetes, the heart disease, the lung disease. I mean, all of these things are going up dramatically in the population in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. And they're also, when you have these diseases, you have a higher risk of a bad outcome of ending up in the ICU with COVID-19. That's been shown in many studies coming out of China, are showing that people who have these conditions are more at risk.
Coming up, Stephanie discusses how beneficial microbes can help break down glyphosate residues. And she also covers other ideas for how to protect ourselves from these toxic residues that surround us.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Chelsea Green. Chelsea Green Publishing is recognized as a leading publisher of books about restorative living, diet-focused integrative health, organic farming, homesteading, local food, and more. Check out all the new, recent, and best-selling titles from Chelsea Green, including The Truth About COVID-19 by Joseph Mercola and Ronnie Cummins, Oneness versus the 1% by Vandana Shiva, and coming soon, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment by MIT scientist Stephanie Seneff. For more on these titles, visit chelseagreen.com. And as a special bonus for Wise Traditions listeners, receive 35% off your total order from Chelsea Green by using the discount code POD35 at checkout. Our ancestors lived in constant connection with the earth by going barefoot or wearing leather-soled moccasins or sandals, which kept them grounded. Connecting your feet to the earth, which is called earthing or grounding, allows the body to take in electrons, which helps restore our natural electric state to enjoy the myriad of health benefits that we can enjoy while taking in the elements like our ancestors did. These days, we're often insulated from this healing earth connection because we're wearing shoes with rubber soles or we're in our cars. Earth Runners is an ancestral-inspired sandal company which has created minimalist earthing sandals to support a more barefoot experience, both physically and electrically. They've taken the millennia-old footwear design known as the huarache, which is a simple sole with a wrapping lace, and they've upgraded it with Vibram soles and earthing technology to give you the most minimalist, natural, and grounded shoe experience you've ever had. I love my Earth Runners, and I plan on taking them with me on my upcoming trip to Ecuador. They're comfortable, and I love that when I can't go barefoot, they still keep me grounded to the earth. So go to earthrunners.com and order today. Use the code WISETRADITIONS for 10% off. That's earthrunners.com and Wise Traditions, one word, with a capital W and a capital T. And enjoy. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. I understand there have been some studies done on the lungs of mice and the effects of e-cigarette vapors. What were the results of those studies?
Yeah, that study was extremely interesting. And that was really what tipped me off to like, wow, maybe this really is something, because it connected very nicely to my theories about how glyphosate works, how its toxicity happens. And in that study, for about 3 months, they exposed them to vapors from e-cigarettes. And then they infected them with a virus, a flu virus. And so they were expecting, I think they were anticipating that it would cause them to be more susceptible to the virus. And indeed it did. And it caused this sort of inflammatory response, this characteristic of how people are responding to COVID-19. But they specifically looked at the lungs to see what was going on. And they observed actually two things that were really singled out in the paper. One was accumulation of fatty deposits inside the macrophages in the lung. The macrophages are the immune cells that come in to fight the infection. And they loaded up on fats. And the second thing was that the surfactant was messed up. The proteins in the surfactants were suppressed by the effect of the fumes that they had for the 3 months. And those proteins are very interesting to me because they have something that's called a collagen-like stalk on these proteins. These proteins are really important for trapping viruses and helping the macrophages to remove them. And those collagen-like stalks are very interesting to me because they are a long sequence of amino acid chain that goes GXY, where every third amino acid is a glycine. They're really loaded up on glycine. That's the same that's true for collagen. And collagen is the most common protein in the body. Something like 25% of our proteins are collagen molecules, and they have long sequences of GXY. Tremendous opportunity for glycine to get substituted by glyphosate, which is what I think is happening. That's so terrible that glyphosate is doing to the body. So it's messing up collagen in our joints and in our bones. I think that's why we have so much trouble with back pain and shoulder pain and hip replacement surgery. All these troubles that we're having with our joints, I think, are connected to glyphosate messing up the collagen. But then glyphosate is messing up the collagen in these surfactant proteins and causing them to be unable to clear the viruses. That's what I suspect is happening. And that's what they saw in this study, that those proteins were affected by the fumes. Now, they, of course, didn't look for glyphosate. They weren't thinking of it at all because people never do. But definitely be something that should be done to see if there is glyphosate in those fumes. And that could account for this, in which case it would also strengthen my theory.
Right. And surfactant proteins are found in the lungs, in addition to other places, obviously.
Yeah, in the lungs. I mean, that's very important in the lungs, the surfactants. The lungs have a lot of surfactants that trap debris that comes in the air, and it allows the macrophages to clear it. Very important. Of course, the lungs are exposed to all kinds of environmental factors all the time. They need to be able to efficiently clear them. I wanted to get back to the fatty acids because that was also very interesting, that the macrophages in the lungs were accumulating fat. This is what is seen in other studies on rats exposed to low-dose glyphosate below the regulatory limits. Exposure to these rats, and these people studied their liver, and they found out that these rats accumulated fats in the macrophages in the liver. So it's the same pattern that was going on in the lungs that happened in the liver when they were exposed orally through the digestive system to the glyphosate. So I think it's just whichever organ gets hit first gets hit with this problem that causes it to accumulate these fats.
So right now, Stephanie, people are frightened of each other. Actually, we're all afraid that we're going to catch this virus from each other, when maybe we should be paying attention a little bit more to the environmental factors at play.
Absolutely. I feel like if you're careful about an environmental exposure, that you should think of this as like getting a cold. Really, if you've got a good, strong immune system, you shouldn't worry about this virus, I think.
Yeah, no. And so I know you've said before, but just to reiterate to our audience, so glyphosate is in our food stream. It's in our air, apparently. It's in the water. How is it this contaminant has taken over, and how can we get rid of it?
I know it's a hard problem. I mean, certainly eating certified organic is very important. I think that's a great way to reduce the burden in your gut. And it hits hard on the gut. It messes up the gut microbes and causes a lot of gut dysbiosis, as you know. So certainly certified organic food is important. I think also getting a nutritious diet, make sure you have plenty of micronutrients and minerals and that sort of thing. Have a healthy whole foods diet, really a Weston Price style diet. Things like, it's interesting, I noticed that Germany and South Korea both seem to have fairly mild response to COVID-19. And both of those are places where people eat a lot of fermented cabbage, the kimchi in South Korea and the sauerkraut in Germany. I think fermented cabbage is probably an extremely healthy food to be eating. Cabbage is a very good source of a high quality sulfur, as well as some interesting polyphenolic compounds, some of these almost medicinal type molecules that are found in plants. And then also the fermentation is providing microbes for probiotics that may even be able to break down glyphosate. I'm hoping that's true. I know that I have found that some species of Acetobacter are able to fully metabolize glyphosate. So it's possible that those microbes are showing up in the sauerkraut. And sauerkraut was used actually in an experiment with cows and showed that it improved their health, cows that had been poisoned by glyphosate.
Really?
So that's very interesting to me.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, there was a study where yes, and I don't know how they thought to give them sauerkraut juice. It was actually sauerkraut juice, but it was part of their treatment program. And I just really would love to know whether these microbes in the sauerkraut are able to clear the glyphosate in your gut, which would be really wonderful if it's true.
Well, and have you been able to share your theory with other scientists or people who may give it consideration and then perhaps address the patient's symptoms or infection differently?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to friends of mine who are chemists and friends who are practitioners, and sharing my ideas with them. And generally, they're quite receptive. I've got one who's got another friend who's an expert on diesel, and he's trying to get his friend interested in actually looking into biodiesel and seeing if there is glyphosate in it. That would be fantastic. So, I hope that somebody listening who has the skill set necessary to be able to perform some of these experiments will do that to see if there's any truth to what I'm saying.
So I have a couple more questions for you before we wrap up. First, tell us about Bhutan, what you know about Bhutan. It's a landlocked country in the East Himalayas, right? And you say that it's had very few cases of COVID, and you have a hypothesis for why.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, it's known to be extremely conscious about the environment. It has extremely healthy air. It's very low on air pollution. And they were really committed to trying to maintain organic, to try to be sort of the organic capital of the world. The government has been messaging this concept that it wants to really emphasize organic food. And so I really think they're getting a lot less exposure to glyphosate, and particularly a lot healthier air in Bhutan. And they have very low infection rate with COVID-19, with the COVID-19 virus.
Yeah. What you've been saying makes so much sense. I mean, it's so almost commonsensical that an issue with our lungs might have something to do with the air that we're breathing.
Well, that's certainly why that was where I looked, that was my thought too. And of course, since I'm always looking at glyphosate, because I do feel glyphosate is a major player in the crisis that we're facing in so many different dimensions right now.
Absolutely. Can you tell the listeners the story of the couple that lived in Seattle? I think Robert and Elizabeth Marr. What happened to them? Tell their story.
Yeah, well, they both got COVID-19 at about the same time, and they both died of it within a couple of days of each other. So it made the news because of that. And they ran a restaurant, a popular restaurant in a section of Seattle that was just a short distance away from a major Interstate 5, so a major Interstate 8-lane highway that was probably spewing out toxic fumes all day long near their restaurant. So I'm just wondering, I used them anecdotally as perhaps the reason why they were both so susceptible is because they worked in an environment where the air was polluted. There's also a lot of glyphosate apparently being used in the Puget Sound area. There's a lot of water around Seattle, and I'm really just wondering whether we're getting exposed to glyphosate from water supplies. Again, studies need to be done. This molecule has not been adequately studied, is really what it comes down to. But they use glyphosate to control weeds along the waterways. They've had some invasive weeds that have caused them to use glyphosate there, and the killer whales are in really bad shape, and nobody understands why. So I think all of that may be connected as well.
But Stephanie, wasn't there a lawsuit against the makers of Roundup because I think some landscaper posed the lawsuit against them because he had developed some non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he won? Didn't that make any changes to how much industry uses glyphosate?
Well, that was certainly very impactful. I was so excited when I was so shocked, actually, and very pleased that he actually won that case with a pretty large settlement on punitive damages because of Monsanto misleading people on this chemical. And he was the first of 3 so far that have actually successfully sued. There was a second one, and then there was a third one that was a couple who had used Roundup extensively on their property, and they both got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And all 3 of them won large punitive damages. And it's still being challenged. They're going through higher courts and whatnot. So I don't think any of them have actually seen that money, which is very frustrating. But it's also caused a lot of other people to rise up and have their complaints as well. There's some tens of 10,000 or something cases pending right now linking glyphosate to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. That certainly has caused people, I think, to be more aware that this chemical is toxic and has had a lot of repercussions. And Bayer's stock also tanked because of all this happening. And I would have hoped that it would lead to Bayer voluntarily removing the product from the market, but that hasn't happened yet. And they're still fighting back. I always think Monsanto finds a way to weasel its way out of every problem that comes its way. It's very skilled at fighting, I think. And it fascinates me that these people don't care that they're causing so much damage, not just to humans, but to all life on Earth, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, it's giving me pause, which is why I'm pausing briefly just to let that sink in. And I think I had even heard that Monsanto was going to develop a new weed killer, but it was going to probably have just different toxins in it, not necessarily glyphosate. Have you heard that too?
Oh, they're always coming up with new ideas, right? They do have this mix now that has dicamba in it. Dicamba is supposed to be much more toxic than glyphosate. And they've had a lot of issues with nearby farmers' lawsuits because dicamba being used on the neighbor's crop is killing their crop. They sell a dicamba resistant. They sell a crop that's now I think it's soy that's dicamba resistant and glyphosate resistant. And then they sell a product that goes with that, with both of those chemicals in it. I think it's a hopeless task to try to control weeds with toxic chemicals. I think we should stop even trying to do that with any toxic chemicals. We should really I think there should be solutions, for example, robotic solutions. There should be ways that we could control weeds without poisoning our food. There has to be a solution. And I think there are people who are working towards that goal. And of course, there are also many farmers who are growing organic food, and I'm so thankful for them. We need more of them, and we need to have a real reckoning with the farmers to realize that they cannot put poisons on our food crops. They simply cannot do that. I think we have to stop all the chemicals, not just the herbicides, but the insecticides, the fungicides. I think we need to learn how to grow our food the way we used to without chemicals.
Such a good word. I agree wholeheartedly. So it sounds like we all, if we want to protect ourselves and our families, should heed the word to the wise, which is to certified organic foods, to pay attention to the air that we're breathing and where we are situated, our home, if it's close to airports or places where there's a lot of exhaust coming, we have to be careful because that is going to impact the function of our lungs and, of course, could make us more vulnerable to any virus coming our way. Is there any other tip you could give us, Stephanie, for protecting ourselves, our families, our communities at this time?
Certainly, the antioxidant defenses are important, and that's one of the things that glyphosate disrupts. It messes up, for example, glutathione, which is really one of our most important antioxidants, which is a problem in this COVID-19 infection because you get overreactive immune system producing all these oxidizing agents that are damaging. So eating foods that are rich in sulfur will give you a base to make glutathione, because glutathione is a sulfur-containing molecule. And so there are supplements even you can take that will help to boost your glutathione. Vitamin C is another one. People are talking about high-dose vitamin C. A lot of my friends are recommending that. Vitamin C is a fantastic antioxidant. And also melatonin. People are recommending taking melatonin, which again, your body normally produces melatonin, not just your pineal gland, which is what helps you sleep, but throughout your body, your cells are able to make their own melatonin, which they use to protect themselves from damage. Melatonin comes out of the shikimate pathway, which is a pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts. So I think we have a melatonin deficiency as well because of glyphosate that's helping to cause oxidizing damage that we can't protect ourselves from.
This is so fascinating. Everything's connected, right? Like people think, oh, I can't sleep. I guess I'm working too hard or I'm stressed. But actually, something in the environment or in their food could be impacting their ability to sleep. Glyphosate.
Right, exactly. It's amazing. Yeah, glyphosate gets everywhere. I mean, it's so incredible to me, all the things that it does. I'm in awe of that molecule, I have to say.
Yes.
It's incredibly damaging.
I understand. Well, thank you for enlightening us on this subject. And I want to ask you now the question I often pose at the end. You may have already answered it, but you might have something else to share. If the listener can do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do, Stephanie?
Well, the one thing I haven't said yet is, maybe I said it, get out in the sunlight, get vitamin D and get natural sunlight exposure, which is not just about vitamin D. I think the sun is incredibly healing and it will strengthen your innate immune system, which is what you desperately need in the face of COVID-19. So get out in the sunlight without sunscreen and without sunglasses.
Thank you so much for that advice. And that is so simple for any of us to do, whatever situation we're in, wherever we live, to get outside in that sunshine, especially if it's not against the law. So thank you, Stephanie, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our guest today was Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Go to chelseagreen.com to find out more about her upcoming book. And I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore, the host and producer of Wise Traditions for the Weston A. Price Foundation. My website is holistichilda.com. And for the transcript of this podcast episode, go to westonaprice.org and click on the podcast page. And now for a review from Apple Podcasts. Thank You by Betsy Tay. Thank you for sharing all of the wonderful things that you do. It makes it easy to share information with friends that reinforces why we live this farming lifestyle that we have chosen. It also validates so many of the principles that we have raised our kids with, and I'm always learning and adding to our healthy practices. Betsy Tay, that means a lot. Thank you for your review. You are also welcome to leave a review on Apple Podcasts anytime. Just click on the link in the episode show notes and leave your review, and hopefully 5 stars. Thank you so much for listening, my friends. Stay well. Hasta pronto.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.